South China Sea is to have a strong American presence. And all we've done for the past 8 years is an occasional freedom of navigation operation to maintain our claim that these are international waters and that the territories are disputed. Now you say, well, who cares about the South China Sea? Number one, it has potentially enormous mineral reserves under the seabed, including oil and gas. Number two, the South China Sea, which is greater in size than the Mediterranean Sea, think about that for a minute, also has 50% of the world's shipborne cargo in any given year. Every barrel of oil that goes from the Middle East to Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and the countries of Southeast Asia goes through the South China Sea. So if China can take what are now international waters and make them into a Chinese lake, it will have its hands around the throats of key economies that are allies and trading partners of the United States. And what they're doing in the South China Sea, they're doing in the East China Sea as well, particularly vis-a-vis Taiwan, which is a functioning democracy. We can give ourselves a little pat on the back that, although obviously the major work was done by the Taiwanese themselves, and they are in grave jeopardy. Not because China wants a war over Taiwan, they want it to fall into their lap like a ripe fruit, the same way they got Hong Kong back from the British. They've tried before to pressure Taiwan. In the late 1990s, they arrayed missiles and forces along the Fujian province coast across the Strait of Taiwan, and Bill Clinton sent 2 carrier battle groups steaming toward Taiwan to show American resolve. And the Chinese backed down. Now, what would happen today if China threatened Taiwan in a comparable fashion? Does anybody think Barack Obama would send 2 carrier battle groups toward Taiwan? Anybody want to raise their hand? And of course, nobody does. And I can tell you, I've asked this question in audiences all across the country for the past 4 or 5 years. I've yet to find one person who would raise his hand. Now, if we can figure it out here, don't you think the people in Beijing can figure it out too? Don't you think they can see the weakness? Of course they can. Of course they can. And it doesn't stop there. China's engaged in a massive increase in its ballistic missile capability and its nuclear arsenal. China is building a blue water navy for the first time in 600 years. Yes, I said 600 years, a blue water navy. They've got one of the most sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities on the planet. They have anti-satellite missiles that are intended to destroy our intelligence gathering capabilities from satellites in the event of hostilities. They have advanced anti-access area denial missile systems to push the U.S. Navy back from the shores of the Western Pacific, where we've been dominant since 1945, and on and on and on. And our response is to watch the size of the United States Navy continue to decline. Governor Romney brought this point up in one of the debates in 2012, and he pointed out accurately that the size of the U.S. Navy today is smaller than at any time since 1916. 100 years ago. And what was Barack Obama's response? Snark. Well, he said, that's just a number. He said, our capabilities today are so much more sophisticated: submarines, aircraft carriers, guided missile capabilities. Well, that's true. That's true. And if our ships today had to fight ships from 1916, they'd be in very good shape. But you know something? Other countries have the same capabilities. And the Chinese capabilities are growing, as are, once again, the Russian capabilities. How far afield are the Chinese looking? Well, a few months ago they had joint maneuvers with Russia in the South China Sea for the first time since the Cold War. But a few months before that, China and Russia conducted joint naval maneuvers in the Eastern Mediterranean, right across from from Israel. Think about that. Chinese naval vessels conducting maneuvers in the Mediterranean. And you know what our fleet in the Mediterranean consists of these days? It consists of a flagship in Italy. And every naval vessel that enters the Strait of Gibraltar, right up until it leaves it through the Suez Canal and vice versa, that's the Sixth Fleet. That's where we are today. And I won't go into a lengthy discussion of the military budget, but let me just say, in President Obama's last budget submission to Congress, the force level of the Army was the same as it was in 1938. Not a good year for the United States. This is the kind of visibility that countries like China and Russia can see and are taking advantage of. And the reason why our allies in East and South Asia are so worried. Now, you know, Asia was supposed to be the pivot that the administration would make from the Middle East. Why? Because our policies in the Middle East are so successful? This is the demonstration across the sweep of territory from Morocco on the Atlantic Ocean, the western coast of Africa, all the way across to Pakistan, of a region where the withdrawal of American attention and interest and strength has caused one of the most massive potential crises for the United States imaginable. We've gone from a position where there's a crisis in country A or a crisis in country B to the entire region descending into chaos. We have seen the collapse of state structures across the region that were put in place after World War I, collapsed into anarchy. We've seen the rise of terrorism, even after the application of America's overwhelming military force in Afghanistan and Iraq. The situation has returned nearly to what it was in the days before the attack on September the 11th, 2001. And just in the past few months, we've had the senior intelligence officials of this administration, General Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, John Brennan, the Director of the CIA, testify in open session of Congress that the terrorist threat around the world today is equal to or greater than it was on 9/11. Certainly we're better able to defend ourselves in some respects, but the terrorist threat itself has grown. And you can see the evidence of it all around the United States and Western Europe. The terrorists are nearly everywhere in this vast swath of territory. They've attacked oil and gas facilities in Algeria. They nearly took over the government of Mali. They have reduced Libya to a series of independent fiefdoms ruled by terrorists and warlords. The government can barely control its own buildings in the capital city of Tripoli. Boko Haram is splitting the scene between Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa, in Nigeria and Cameroon and elsewhere. Having sworn allegiance to ISIS, they've now decided they're too big for ISIS, at least for now, and they're accumulating more power all across the continent. Sudan is again dissolving into civil war. Somalia hasn't had an effective government in 25 years. Egypt has lost control of the Sinai Peninsula, and traffickers in drugs and human traffickers and weapons of mass destruction, assisting terrorists all over the world, use it as a caravan route. In Yemen, the back door, in effect, to the oil-producing monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula, it has completely collapsed as a state and has the distinction of hosting the headquarters of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a functioning branch of ISIS, and the Houthi rebels, who are effectively surrogates for the Ayatollahs in Tehran. And just a few days ago, the Houthi launched missiles supplied to them by Iran and quite possibly fired by Iranian Revolutionary Guards officers who were there with them, fired at a United States destroyer just north of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the southern end of the Red Sea. Now again, you say, well, that's pretty far away. Look, if the Houthi or anybody else can close that strait, or at least raise the risk so high that insurance premiums go through the ceiling, going to have a tremendous effect on all of the ocean-borne traffic that goes through the Suez Canal. It will have a dramatic impact on Europe's economy and therefore on ours. And it gets worse. ISIS has, along with several other factors, in effect destroyed the countries of Iraq and Syria. They are not coming back together again in the way they were set up after World War I. Even if ISIS is defeated, as it could be, and should have been 2 years ago, the fractures that exist in those two countries and the pressure they put on Jordan, the collapse of Lebanon is anything other than a subsidiary of Hezbollah, which itself is a creature of Iran, doesn't give any cause for optimism. In Turkey, we have seen President Erdogan, in the wake of the failed military coup, dramatically advance his stated intention to create a new caliphate, the last caliphate having been dissolved when the Ottoman Empire was ended, and to have Turkey at the head of it. Erdogan, when he was mayor of Istanbul 20 years or so ago, once said, democracy is like a streetcar. You ride it to the stop you want, and then you get off. And he's getting off. And he's taking Turkey out of the Western orbit where Kemal Ataturk tried to put it 100 years ago and moving it back into the Middle East. All of this having been accompanied by the flow of millions of refugees into Europe. How many of them are terrorists? We don't know. Last year, when Chancellor Merkel of Germany said that Germany would accept 800,000 refugees, which in percentage terms is the equivalent of the United States accepting 3.5 million refugees. That's the effect it will have on Germany. One of the ministers of the Lebanese cabinet said that he thought that probably 2% of those refugees would be terrorists. Doesn't sound like much. 16,000 people, that's what he means. 16,000 terrorists. So Turkey's turn away from the West and the threat it poses in the region is growing. As I say, Syria and Iraq have collapsed as states. And then we come to Iran. Let's skip Iran for a minute. Let's do Afghanistan and Pakistan. Afghanistan, now with the substantial reduction of American forces there, facing ever greater pressure from Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They're now in parts of the country that were cleared out by us almost immediately after 9/11. And if America did withdraw its last forces, Taliban would retake Afghanistan and once again use it as a base for international terrorist activities through Al-Qaeda. And right next door in Pakistan, if that happened in its neighbor, the government of Pakistan, which has been perpetually unstable since the partition when the British left in the late 1940s, Pakistan could fall to its version of Taliban or some other radical group, which would put immediately its arsenal of nuclear weapons, estimated publicly at somewhere between 60 and 200, in the hands of terrorists immediately. Now let's come back to Iran, which has been granted by the Vienna Agreement in the summer of 2015 an essentially free path toward deliverable nuclear weapons. Anybody who thinks that this agreement restrains them hasn't been paying attention. Iran wanted relief from the economic sanctions, that's true, and to get that relief it made minimal, easily reversible concessions on its nuclear program. In response, it got between $100 and $150 billion of assets unfrozen, and any number of other benefits that we learn about as they kind of dribble out, because our administration wouldn't tell us what they've agreed to with Iran, including, obviously, the cash for hostages ransom deal. So Iran continues all of its objectionable activity that it engaged in before this deal. Its continued support for international terrorism. Iran, since the Ayatollahs took power in 1979, has been the principal financer in the world of terrorist activities. On an equal opportunity basis, they fund the Shia Hezbollah in Lebanon, Sunni Hamas in the Gaza Strip. They've assisted their former sworn enemy, the Taliban in Afghanistan. They provided weapons and training to Shiite militias in Iraq that killed Americans back before we withdrew, and we did nothing about it. And their activities with North Korea, another nuclear threat, which has now detonated 5 nuclear devices, in which our commander of U.S. forces, Korea and South Korean Defense Forces, believe puts the North in a very short period of time, less than 2 years, capable of launching a ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead from North Korea that can land on the west coast of the United States, and which has been cooperating with Iran on ballistic missiles since at least the late 1990s, and we think cooperating on the nuclear side as well. That's what the axis of evil meant. It was not just a metaphor. And all of this continues unabated. How bad is it? How bad is this deal? Paul Ryan, certainly one of the mildest-mannered people on Capitol Hill, said that Secretary of State John Kerry was shilling for the Ayatollahs and that he was acting like the president of the Chamber of Commerce of Tehran, which is about as dramatic a thing as Ryan has ever said, and is no understatement in this case. Now, I could go on. I like to say I spread sweetness and light wherever I go. But the point is, you need to hear it all laid out in that summary fashion to see we are in trouble around the world. We're not in trouble because we're a weaker, poorer nation. We're in trouble because our own leadership has made conscious decisions to reduce American power under the mistaken idea it will make the world a safer place. The world is not getting safer. The world is getting more dangerous. The proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, those weapons falling into the hands of terrorists, make the prospect of 9/11 pale by comparison, I'm sorry to say. So this is why I urge citizens all over the country, as they think about what's going to happen in 4 weeks, to get your priorities straight on what the United States needs in terms of leadership. If we continue doing what we've been doing for the past 8 years, the hole that we're in will not only get deeper, it may get impossible to get out of. I mean, there does come a point where it just gets out of control. It's not enough simply to reverse the policies of the past 8 years, because things have happened that are not reversible easy. Like the Russian air base constructed just within the past year at Latakia in Syria. Minutes flying time from Israel's northern border. That's just not going to disappear because we want it to. So, you have to decide on your priorities. There's an old saying, I actually sort of hope it's not true, that you get the kind of government you deserve. We can only do what we can do as citizens, but I think if we don't put the security of the United States as the first issue, and the qualification of candidates for the presidency, the Senate, and the House as the top priorities, we are going to get the kind of government we deserve. I have a lot more faith in the American people. I think they are collectively wiser than the political class in Washington. They know what's happening to the country. And they need to speak up before it's too late, to put the secondary issues in second place and to put American national security first. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to take questions if we can find somebody who will smile and ask a question. Yes, sir, in the back. And if you can just speak so I can hear it, I'll repeat it for you.
Other than occupying countries with boots on the ground or supporting other government officials that we don't necessarily have good relations with, what do you think we should do to prevent all these problems in the Middle East from coming back on us?
The question is, other than putting boots on the ground or supporting people who we don't necessarily like, what do we do to stop these problems in the Middle East from coming back on us? And the answer is, in the short term, I'm not sure we have any option other than to increase our involvement, including boots on the ground, specifically with respect to ISIS. We've got boots on the ground now, although nobody seems to be willing to admit it. We have one candidate who says she'll never put boots on the ground, which means she'd have to withdraw something like 6,000 American personnel from Iraq and 500 or 600, maybe more, we don't know the exact number because it's classified, from Syria. ISIS has to be defeated, and we shouldn't do it by allying with Iran or its surrogates, the Assad regime, Hezbollah, or the government in Baghdad. We've got allies in the region that should play a major role, and that includes, before we lose them forever, the Turks, certainly the Kurds, and the Arab states of the region. But nobody's going to put the coalition together other than us, and they're not going to be participating in it unless we participate in it. People can say, well, they're the ones most at harm. That's true, and that's why they have to participate. But we're at risk as well, and we've suffered casualties in the United States from ISIS terrorists who have been sent here, and there are undoubtedly more coming. But I recur again to what I said at the beginning. The ideal situation is that we are strong enough that the adversaries around the world don't dare to take us on. And that is going to take substantial time and effort, and let's be clear, resources to rebuild what we've squandered over the past 8 years. It's not enough to say, I'm just not going to pay attention to it, because they're paying attention to us. And that's part of what it takes to sustain the way of life here at home. I don't make this argument on the basis that we want the world order because we want the world order. We want stability because it benefits us. Are there free riders out there? There are people who are taking advantage of us. There's no doubt about it. But nobody's going to protect us better than us. We're not doing it for everybody else. We're doing it for ourselves. And if we stop doing it, nobody's going to do it for us. Yes, sir. The question is, isn't it really ideology on the side of those who have been pursuing these policies, and we don't really have anything comparable to it? Well, I think it is ideology. I think it's a view of the world that has the place of America inverted from what it should be. And that's why I say it's so common in our great universities. I do think we have the counter for it. Ronald Reagan called it peace through strength. And that requires that American strength be visible and that the threat to use it be deemed real. That when we say words like red lines, we actually mean what we say. So there's obviously a lot of repair work that needs to be done, but I don't think it's impossible. I think the longer you go without taking the necessary steps, the more difficult it becomes until the point where it does become impossible. That's why I wish there were more discussion of national security affairs, because in an election campaign, goodness, if the politicians don't listen to us now, when are they ever going to listen to us? And so this, I'm not a fan of the debates. I don't think they're really debates. I mean, after all, who was the moderator in the Lincoln-Douglas debate? Yeah, there wasn't the moderator. Oh, God, how did they do that? And that's exactly what we ought to go back to, where the candidates would have to talk about substance. But, you know, it's up, I think, to the citizens to demand that the people address it, and we just need a lot more of that. How do we counter the university propaganda machine? Well, there are a lot of things that have changed since this problem took hold, and it's been half a century, really, or more, that the universities have been this way. There are a lot of alternative means of communication that we didn't have before. Many of you were kind enough to say you watch Fox News, and on behalf of the shareholders, I'm not one of them, but on behalf of them, I appreciate that. We've got the internet now. When I was a boy growing up, there were 3 networks. And in Baltimore, there were 3 television stations. Well, think of that today. I think it's open to us to do what we need to do, but the universities are continuing, in my view, to abandon their own basic principles about open and free inquiry and the free exchange of ideas, the unwillingness to allow robust debate on universities is a huge problem. And it's one of the reasons I think that unless there are more leaders in Congress that are willing to talk about these issues, it's going to be very hard to change the overall tenor of the debate. I think since the end of the Cold War, when the Clinton administration declared a peace dividend was at hand, because, as the phrase went at the time, we had reached the end of history, is manifestly false. So what you've raised is a very important question, but it's certainly not one that's going to be resolved quickly, that's for sure. Yes, sir. The question is, how does the fact that we're China's largest trading partner with the enormous trade imbalance we have act as a deterrent? And I'm glad you asked the question that way, because too many people say, my God, China holds all of this debt, how can we possibly stand up to it? When in fact any economic interrelationship is a two-way street. And the saying that always comes to my mind is, when you owe the bank $10,000, you've got a problem. But when you owe the bank $1 million, they've got a problem. Too often in government and in business, people say, but if we do anything, China will do something terrible, so we don't do anything at all, which is a form of self-censorship, in effect, that never tests what China's going to do. I think that if they saw, whether it's on the economic front or the political front, more strength from the United States, they'd be more responsible. Right now, if you look at the annual reports that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong and Beijing put out, the EU Chambers of Commerce say the same thing. The Chinese are routinely violating the basic commitments they made to get into the World Trade Organization. They steal intellectual property at a faster rate than any other country in the world. Foreign investors do not get justice in Chinese courts. There are discriminatory regulatory practices in favor of state-owned enterprises in China against foreign investors and traders that are simply unanswerable. So, when you sign an agreement that's supposed to be a free trade agreement and the other party violates it, you need to call them to account. And this is a problem the U.S. bureaucracy has kind of across the board, of saying some other country is violating the agreements they've made. In the arms control area, where I've labored, unfortunately, for many years, I tried to get my bureaucrats to say things like, Russia is violating the Chemical Weapons Convention. And they just were kind of physically unable to do it. They could say things like, Russia is in apparent non-compliance with its obligations. And in the trade area, it's the same thing. So an advocate that says, actually, I believe in free trade, and when you sign up to a free trade agreement, we're going to make you honor your commitments, would be a huge change, and a welcome one, I think. Yes, sir, all the way in the back. So the question is, what is the economic gain for Russia in invading Georgia or invading Ukraine? I'm not sure they're measuring it in economic terms. I think they're measuring it in ethnic and strategic terms. And they're showing to all of the states of the former Soviet Union, the newly independent states as they were once called, that they don't have any alternative but to take Russia's fiat as non-negotiable. And it's that then produces economic benefit to Russia, number one, because they can impose their will, as they do through their pricing of the oil and gas that they pipe into Eastern and Central Europe, and then often on to Western Europe as well. I'm sure there are people in this room who have had the same conversation I've had with Europeans who say, we wish you'd export natural gas and oil and get rid of all your restrictions, because we like the competition, but more importantly, we like the strategic alternative of buying from somebody other than Russia or the Middle East. And really, it's the expression of power, physically and militarily, that ultimately gets Russia the benefit. And second, on the ethnicity thing, that's what the annexation of the Crimea was about. That's what the conflict in the Donbass region of the eastern Ukraine about. That's why if they go after the Baltic republics, they're going to be provoking potential clashes on the basis that ethnic Russians in the Baltics are being repressed. And that has a huge political benefit for Putin and his regime. As is so often the case, even when there's economic difficulty at home, There's no better cure for that in terms of mobilizing support for the regime than to blame it on some foreigner and to engage in a foreign conflict. It's worked for Putin. He's played an extremely weak hand very well, and he's continuing to do it. And remember, his objective is reestablish Russian dominance in the space of the former Soviet Union and expand from there. And he's being successful at it, and he's gotten enormous support from the Russian people as a result. The question is there any chance the silent majority can bring in our candidate as president? The answer is they've got to get out and vote. You know, I really do believe that if you listen to people in Washington, they are caught in a bubble. And I know that because I live in the bubble. And out in the rest of the country, people don't think the way a lot of people in Washington think. And this is not a phenomenon unique to the United States. In 17th and 18th century England, they didn't have political parties, obviously, as we understand them today, but they used to talk about the country party versus the court party. And what they meant by that is out in the English landscape, there were people who looked at the sin and corruption of the court in London and said, we got to fix that. And the people in London didn't realize they were corrupt and sinful. They thought everybody was like that. And it was a source of enormous tension within English society. It ultimately did lead to the creation of movements and factions that became political parties. But that clash of view, I think, is very much in evidence now. You know, how it'll come out, I don't know, but it's not going to go away. I don't know what the outcome of the election will be, but if anybody thinks this disparity in view between the elites and the broader population is temporary, they're wrong. You'll hear, I'm sure, from Daniel Hannan what people in England thought about the possibility of the Brexit referendum succeeding. You can see it all over Europe today. So it's a very tumultuous time, but I mean, it's just impossible at this point to say with any sense of confidence what the outcome will be. We take one or two more here. Yes, sir. What would I suggest to the next president to increase the influence of NATO and reduce the influence of Putin? The second is actually easier. Putin doesn't want conflict. He's going to get as much as he can without conflict. But if he actually found resistance, I believe he would back down. Remember, since NATO was created in the late 1940s, no foreign force has ever crossed the NATO border. So when people say, oh, this deterrence is so dangerous and whatnot, it brought peace to Europe because there was certainty in the minds of the people in the Kremlin that if they did cross a NATO border with military force, the consequences to them would be unacceptable. That's why countries like Georgia and Ukraine have been at risk, because they're not part of the alliance. And it's also why, if Putin tests us in the Baltics, it's important not just for them, it could result in the collapse of the NATO alliance, or at least revealing it to be completely empty if we allow the Russians to do it without retaliation, which we don't want, which goes back to the point why deterrence is so important. And I think there has to be a real decision by the Europeans that they want to live up to their own commitments about what their defense obligations are going to be, to reform NATO, which has a sclerotic decision-making apparatus, and to be prepared, in my view, to do what's really important, which is to take NATO, as former Spanish Prime Minister Jose Maria Aznar has proposed, and make it a global alliance. Bring in Japan, Australia, Singapore, Israel. You know, people talk about having a League of Democracies as an alternative to the UN. We've already got a League of Democracies. It's called NATO. Let's make it worldwide. That's what I would do. But we also have to be prepared to say to the Europeans, as I once did to a BBC interviewer who was even more obnoxious than usual, than most BBC interviewers are, when he was objecting to something that I was saying about American policy. And I said, you know, you can push the United States on this or other issues only so far, because at some point somebody in the United States will say in response, the next time you in Britain or Europe are threatened by a hostile, authoritarian, militaristic regime, do let us know how it turns out. Okay, one more over in the back. Yeah, is this a problem of getting people to ignore the dreamy rhetoric and focus on the reality? And honestly, I don't think so out among the American voters. I think they understand it. I think they get it better than many of the people in Washington. I'll just give you an example. In 2014, when ISIS began beheading Americans overseas, they were beheading Christians in Libya, they were burning a Jordanian pilot to death, they were drowning people in cages. You could feel all across the country, and it was reflected in the election. People said, you know, we don't like Americans being beheaded, because they understood that the threat that they were seeing to individual Americans in some faraway country was really a much shorter distance to threats in the United States than sheer geography would indicate. So I think the people are ready to hear a message that says peace through strength is the way to get peace and